Good morning. My name is Ingrid Kvalvik. I work at Nofima, a research institute in Norway, and I have been leading this work on the analysis of the governance of the EU external fishing fleet. So what I will do now is briefly present a couple of work we have conducted in this task. The European has had bilateral fisheries agreement with countries in Africa and the Pacific for more than 40 years. These agreements enable the EU long-distance fleet to continue their fishing activities in these waters in exchange for financial compensation. Currently, there are 13 agreements in force, 9 tuna agreements and 4 mixed agreements. In the FarFish project, we have analyzed 4 of these access agreements, one with Cape Verde, Mauritania, Senegal, and the Seychelles. In addition, the fisheries in the international waters in the Southeast and Southwest Atlantic have been studied. But let's start with the bilateral fisheries agreements. Over the years, these agreements have been heavily criticized for not being sustainable, for the lack of equity and limited economic benefit for the partner countries, for lack of transparency, amongst others. The EU's own evaluation have generally and repeatedly concluded that the control of its external fleet is too weak, as is the control of the fleets operating in many of these waters. Still, the EU fisheries policy has been substantially improved since the adoption of the first generation of access agreement in the 1980s. Through regular reforms of the European Common Fisheries Policy, new standards and management principles are adopted, and the requirement for how to monitor and control the external fishing fleets has seen big changes. In the FarFish project, we have examined whether these policies have become part of the access agreements. Do we see a similar development in the agreements the EU negotiate with these coastal states? To understand the development in the access agreement, it can be useful to start with the EU's own policy and how to govern its long-distance fishing fleet. The EU Common Fishery Policy has a 10-year reform cycle where new policies for the fisheries are adopted, both for the fisheries taking place within community waters and outside. Related to the external dimension, which is of interest to us today, we see a clear shift in the 2002 policy reform. The first access agreements were mainly commercial and were generally considered pay-fish-go agreements, and there were not much focus on the external dimension in the Common Fisheries Policy. Still, with the Common Fisheries Policy reform in 1992, new rules on fisheries management were introduced, including the vessel licensing system, and the Fisheries Authorization Regulation was adopted and applied to EU vessels operating outside community waters. The Control Regulation was adopted, setting detailed rules for member states to monitor and report the activities and catches from their vessels, also those operating in waters of third countries and on the high seas. So even though the general objective of the access agreements remained the same, pay fish go, the EU's instruments to govern the external fleet was substantially strengthened with the 1992 reform. But the main change with the 2002 reform was the introduction of the term fisheries partnership agreements, which put the focus on partnership and on development of sustainable fisheries in the partner countries. And the partnership should involve active cooperation between the EU and the partner country, also on monitoring and control of fisheries. To promote this, sectoral support was introduced, where part of the EU payment should be earmarked to strengthen the capacity of partner countries to manage their fisheries sustainably. In the following years, all EU regulation for governing the external fishing fleet were updated and strengthened. And the general technological development also allowed for the use of electronic tools in fisheries management, like e-logbooks, VMS, IAS, and digital storing and exchange of data were introduced, all which were part of EU regulation. In this period, the fight against IUU fishing were high on the political agenda and were incorporated into the regulations, amongst other by not allowing authorizations of vessels being involved in IUU fishing. Today, these access agreements are termed SFPAs, Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreements, and this was introduced by the Common Fisheries Reform in 2013. The main change regarding the external dimension is the obligation to better control fisheries taking place outside SFPAs. There were, however, new provisions related to reflagging, support vessels, and transshipment to improve control of the fishing operators and catches, which also impacted on the authorization of vessels fishing under SFPAs. So what we see is that the EU policy on their foreign fleet has developed quite a lot. And this was the backdrop for the analysis of the development of the 4 SFPAs in FarFish. And we wanted to examine, has the EU been able to implement this policy on the external dimension of the common fishery policy into the bilateral fisheries agreements? A very long sentence. The access agreements provide fishing opportunity for a specified time period, usually 4 years, after which they have to be prolonged or renegotiated. And for each new agreement or protocol, therefore, we see that new requirements for monitoring, control, and surveillance are introduced. The development was analyzed along 3 main areas: changes in the provision on authorization of fishing vessels, new procedures and technologies for improved monitoring, control, and surveillance, and new modes of cooperation between the parties. Our studies show that the provision generally follow the development in the common fisheries policy and accompanying implementation regulation. But in some cases, developments are taking place earlier than in the EU regulations. And not surprisingly, a major change occurred with the introduction of the FPA in 2002. Both the form, the content, and the level of detail in the agreements and protocol negotiated after this clearly reflects new governing ideas and commitment to better monitor the fisheries. The general technological development and use of electronic monitoring and reporting for fisheries activities has also been introduced in the access agreement, but there are clear implementation challenges. We also see a difference between the 4 cases. Especially the mixed fisheries agreement with Mauritania do not always follow the same pattern as the others. Several issues are introduced earlier in this agreement, and adjustments are made to accommodate the requirements according to implementation challenges in Mauritania. Despite the progress, the implementation of new requirements is often slow and sometimes difficult to achieve. So even though new agreements and protocols are in line with the reformed common fisheries policy and associated regulations, this does not necessarily mean that the requirements are implemented. Sometimes it takes several protocols from a requirement being introduced before it is implemented. Often it is not implemented at all. The observer requirement is an example of the latter. There are persistent demand for a high level of observers on board the EU vessels are maintained over decades in 3 of the 4 cases, but without the partners so far being able to address the underlying challenge of ensuring sufficient number of observers. As for slow implementation, both the introduction of VMS and electronic reporting can serve as examples. Even though electronic reporting were to be implemented by EU vessel by 2011, introducing ERS into the access agreement have been slow. This gradual and slow implementation might be a viable approach and a way for EU to be able to actually implement its external fisheries policy, in particular when it's accompanied by capacity building initiatives and increased cooperation, something we might expect to see with the introduction of the ERS. On the other hand, if the monitoring control requirements are not implemented and are not adjusted to the actual situation, they might end up as paper regulation, which over time will undermine the credibility and sustainability of the different instruments to regulate the fisheries. Before I conclude, I would like to briefly mention the studies of the high seas fishery. The Southwest and Southeast Atlantic regions are quite different. Not only is there a substantial fisheries taking place in the Southwest Atlantic and a very limited fishery taking place in the Southeast Atlantic, there is a rather well-functioning RFMO in the Southeast, but no multilateral cooperation in the Southwest. In the FarFish project, we have analyzed the barriers for establishing an international arrangement for governing the fisheries of the straddling fish stocks in the Southwest Atlantic. And we have identified some initiatives to overcome these barriers and to improve the governance of the fishery. In a situation where there are challenges of committing the both relevant coastal states and distant water fishing nations, the initiative from both research communities and non-governmental and industry organizations are considered important yet small steps toward creating a new governmentality. Rather than relying on concerted top-down processes and solutions, seeking bottom-up initiatives and solutions like this are a way of establishing a new mode of governing, with the potential of gradually involving new actors and new concerns, and hence establishing a basis for a multilateral agreement. Thank you.